The state of play of the Asian American voter and nested within it, the Asian Indian voter, the Kamala Harris moment in American politics is quite the time to check in, I guess. So we have with us Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan, a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California, Riverside, and the presiding guru of Asian American and Pacific Islander data, which features demographic data and policy research on this community. Professor Ramakrishnan, thank you for your time today. I'll begin by asking you to set the scene for us. The US 2020 elections and then Georgia. All of it is quite a reckoning, isn't it, for the Asian American community?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Going into 2020, when people were asking me what should we expect, I was saying that we should be expecting record turnout. And the reason was because if you looked at 2018, if you looked at the data, in terms of trying to accurately measure what the turnout increase was in an election, you actually have to wait a few months. So in the spring of 2019, when the current population survey released that turnout data, it showed a massive jump in Asian American turnout between 2014 and 2018. And it had record levels of turnout. We've never seen that in a midterm election. Why was that the case? Well, people might say there's only one explanation. I would say there's probably two. One is Donald Trump. Uh, Trump was not on the ballot. It was a midterm election, but that election was seen as a referendum on Trump. If you remember, I mean, precursor to what we saw with the Capitol a few weeks ago, um, Charlottesville had occurred before the 2018 election. Healthcare was a major issue in the 2018 election. And that really mobilized a lot of people, including some people in favor of Donald Trump, too. Right? He was a very polarizing figure. On top of that, you had many congressional races that were competitive, where the Asian American community was significant for the first time in many of these races. So those two factors help explain what drove up turnout. Just the kind of the natural presence of Donald Trump and all of the feelings that he evokes, but also these competitive congressional districts in places like Southern California, New Jersey, Northern Virginia, other places that have significant Asian American populations. Fast forward to 2020, same dynamics. One question was, how the pandemic might affect it, it might have made people reluctant to vote. But most of these states opened up early voting and vote by mail that made it easier for people who might be concerned about their health and safety.
Staying on Georgia for a moment, David Perdue mocking Kamala Harris's name. Look where we've gotten from there to this point. The blowback came instantly, the my name is blowback. And then the Democrats won Georgia, delivered the Senate, and look at the number of Indian names on the Biden cabinet and the White House inner circle. Wow, right?
It's important to disaggregate the data, as we say it, right? Separate the Asian data. Asian is a race in the United States. It's an official category. There are a lot of different nationalities and ethnic groups within that. And Indians, in fact, are the largest group, not in terms of the voting eligible population, but in terms of the resident population in the United States. I think most people don't recognize that. In fact, it's a pattern that's only been apparent in the last year. And so you can't just have an quote unquote Asian outreach strategy. It has to also be sensitive to the needs of Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, et cetera. By the way, this is true for all racial groups. You can't just have a Black mobilization strategy or a Latino mobilization strategy or even a white mobilization strategy. Um, at the same time, there are some issues that resonate across groups. So healthcare is something that resonates across groups. Asian Americans, including Indians, have been strong supporters of universal healthcare, expanding healthcare access. So that's an issue that resonated. What you did see in Georgia, I mean, Georgia was, I think, the most expensive Senate race ever because, well, there were two races, those runoffs, and it was because it was so critical to party control of the Senate. So, in fact, I was speaking to some relatives who live in Georgia who were just sick and tired of getting multiple phone calls and text messages because they had already voted. But in some ways, it's actually a good thing, right? I mean, what the literature shows us is multiple contacts mean higher likelihood of voting. It's very rare for someone to get a knock on the door, multiple text messages, and they're like, you know what? I'm getting bugged too much. I'm not going to vote because they're bugging me. But that's you saw investments in Asian American outreach at levels we've never seen before, and so that absolutely made a difference. But certainly the news coverage and how important that election is for the future of our country also made a difference.
There was a study that you put out just before the elections, which showed that 16% of prospective voters in the 2020 race were still undecided, or, as it often happens, they were just unwilling to reveal their preferences. Where do we stand now? How much do we know after that?
Yeah, so this is when it comes to survey research specifically to Asian Americans, what we've seen in the past is, very high proportion of don't knows, not just in terms of who to vote for, but even in a state like California when there are ballot propositions. And it's a very good question you ask. Is it don't know or I don't want to tell you, right? And I would say from that 16%, we didn't do a post-election survey this year. When we've done it in the past, about 8 to 10% have said they don't know. They said that they voted, and then they say they don't know who they voted for. So that that I would imagine that that's maybe about half of that proportion who said don't know, probably knew and didn't want to reveal their preferences. What we projected, when it comes to finding out accurate numbers of how Asian Americans voted, it's really tough because most of the national surveys don't have Asian American samples and they don't do interviews in Asian languages. Based on our pre-election survey, we estimated that Joe Biden would win about two-thirds of the Asian American vote. Among Indians in particular, we estimated that Biden would win 70% of the Asian American uh, of the Indian American vote. That is lower than what Obama achieved in 2012. That was a high watermark. Um, and what we found was there was actually a shift. Now, Biden is still winning all Indian demographic groups, but he had more support among women than among men. So, like we've seen in other communities, there does seem to have been a shift up among Indian American men towards Trump between 2016 and 2020. That might surprise a lot of people, but there's some good explanations for that, I think.
Which are
So, while we were in the 2016 to 2020 period, um, you know, I guess in a bottom line, what I would say is that incumbency and being the president has its advantages. So if you look, one important thing about the Indian American community to recognize is that most of the growth in the electorate is coming because of naturalizations, right? Indian Americans are among the fastest growing immigrant groups in the country. And so these are not voters that have like hard and strong party affiliation. You could point to all of the things Trump has done, from his rhetoric to his immigration policies to healthcare, that have been harmful to many of our communities. At the same time, these symbolic gestures, people dismiss symbolic gestures as meaningless, but those symbolic gestures can also make a difference for voters who think, he cares about people like me, or he's opening doors for people like me, right? So that Howdy Modi rally, going to India, our survey doesn't show that foreign policy matters much at all in voter calculations, but it's those intangibles, nominating people like Nikki Haley and others. So, but looking ahead now, Biden has his chance to enjoy the powers of incumbency. You have Kamala Harris as VP. You have folks like, first of all, Kamala Harris is Indian American and Black, right? You also have folks like Neera Tanden, very prominent appointment if it gets confirmed as the head of Office of Management and Budget. And you have other Indians and South Asians that have senior and important roles. So um, I anticipate that Biden and Harris will win back some of those voters in the next 4 years.
You told a reporter just before the elections, I think it was Hua Su, that people have traditionally thought of Asian Americans in terms of dim sum rather than samosas. I think we've gotten much further than that now, right?
Well, yeah, I would say now it's dosas and idli and sambar as opposed to just samosas and chicken tikka masala. That to me was fascinating with Kamala Harris. That so not only did you, I mean, there's so many different ways people have used to describe her: South Asian, Indian American. Some people, I understand that there's like a lot of politicization in the diaspora community about whether it should be called South Asian or Indian, but she was specifically South Indian and Tamil, right? And even though she didn't mention her caste, it's a very particular like Tamil Brahmin experience that she comes out of. Um, but what was interesting was that yeah, she was not trying to pander to speak about some kind of generic Indian American or South Asian American experience. She was talking about her relationship with her mother and her ancestors, right, and relatives in India. And I think that came off as very authentic for a lot of people. So even if you weren't Tamil or South Indian, you could see that this is someone who's not faking it in terms of what India meant for them. It did get her into a little bit of trouble in terms of some of the comments she had made. Although I think from a fairly objective point of view, they're fairly mild in terms of human rights issues in India. Um, but it'll be very interesting to see what kind of role she plays and what the relationship with the Indian American community will be. I from all I can tell, I mean, we've not done surveys since, but from all we can tell, there's a lot of enthusiasm and eagerness to engage with the Biden administration, but also with the office of the vice president. It's going to be historic.
I'd like to bookend this conversation with some data. There are 25 line items in your breakup of API communities. Since 2000, the Asian American population in the US has grown by more than 70% to about 20 million. The group itself makes up about 6% of the total population. And during this time, the number of eligible Asian American voters has doubled. By 2025, they'll be the country's largest immigrant group. What are you tracking? What should we be tracking? What are you looking at? What's popping?
I think we should be looking at immigration, certainly. The Trump administration did a lot on immigration that affected Asian American communities. From refugee admissions, bringing it down to a trickle. And that affected, for example, Burmese refugees and other refugee populations. Asylum claims were also very heavily scrutinized. So I think for those populations, we should expect to see an increase. Immigration reform through legislation, I'm not so sure. In fact, I just have a book that came out a few months ago. It's called Citizenship Reimagined. And what it argues is that when you think about immigration reform, we should be looking at immigration reform at the state level, um, probably in the short term, more so than at the federal level. Even though Democrats now have control over both houses of Congress, they don't have a filibuster proof majority. And there's absolutely no appetite among the moderate Democrats to just allow a bare 50 vote majority on important legislation like on immigration. I, I can say with almost certainty that is not going to happen. So anything that's left will be left to the president. Healthcare is also going to be an important issue on so many levels. Not only is it an important priority, so many Asian Americans are over indexed in the healthcare professions, not only doctors, but nurses and others. We've seen that in terms of COVID, in terms of what the challenges were. So I think that's also going to be important to see what the healthcare sector looks like. Finally, I'll say that, this is another thing that I've said to some reporters is that we're probably going to see a kind of Kamala effect, right? You're probably going to see a lot more Asian Americans and Indian Americans in particular, but also women, right? We haven't seen as many Asian American women in prominent positions as men, although those numbers have improved. So I think just as Donald Trump had this mobilizing effect, and a lot of women ran for office in 2018. I would anticipate a lot of women um, that those numbers to continue to increase, and especially among women of color.
As an Indian American yourself, what does Kamala Harris's ascendancy mean to you at a personal level?
And I say this as someone who is nonpartisan, right? So AAPI data is nonpartisan, and I myself, I'm not registered as either a Democrat or a Republican. At the same time, I think it's undeniable how important this moment is. There was a kind of a joke image that was circulating on WhatsApp, right? And that's where a lot of our communities use for social media. And it had a picture of the White House, and above it, it said Kamala Vilas, right? And it's a play on the restaurant Kamala Vilas, right, which is a South Indian restaurant. And that I think symbolizes for a lot of people, it's when you see yourself in leadership, of course, not yourself, but people who look like you in leadership, that's very inspiring. Now, what also matters, in the past, people could say, well, Bobby Jindal ran, Nikki Haley was ambassador to the UN. This is where what we see is that it's not just having someone who looks like you, but someone whose values and priorities are close to your values and priorities. And in that way, Kamala Harris is much closer to where the vast majority of the Indian American population is than someone like Nikki Haley. So say that Haley runs in 2024 or 2028. If we have a Harris Haley matchup, I think Harris wins hands down, because it's not as much who your parents are, um, or even, I mean, what your party affiliation is certainly will make a difference. There are a lot more Indian American Democrats than Republicans, but it's also their values and their priorities. And on issue after issue, Indian Americans are much more likely to be on the side of where the Democrats stand than where the Republicans stand. And so that will be, I think, interesting to see. But yes, just looking now at this moment as a human being and as someone who's an immigrant to this country. I'm an immigrant to this country. It's very inspiring, and I think there's a lot I think that is very concerning about our country right now. But I think dynamics like this give hope to show that we're rounding the corner and building a racial democracy. Right. I mean, one final thing I'll say is either the explicit words of Donald Trump or all of the insinuations and implications and all the people who got empowered by him was trying to take our country back decades in terms of immigrants and people of color feeling like they belonged. So I think that we are going to see a shift. It's going to be a struggle. Nothing comes easy in this country when it comes to racial minorities or immigrants feeling like they belong. But I'm feeling hopeful moving forward.
Professor Ramakrishnan, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. All right.
Thanks.